Okay, welcome to our last biology EOC review. Today we're going to go through and cover just the basics. I mean, it's just a skimming of several of the body systems. So I'm going to move quickly. If you have questions or concerns, you can, those of you that are in the class can stop me, or if you're watching this video or this audio recording, you can email me or join me Wednesday for our open office hours. Now, our last question and answer session on Thursday will I'm going to conduct that, but I will also open it up for questions. So come prepared if you have any questions, last minute questions or concerns that you'd like to discuss before the exam. That would be Thursday. Okay, let's start with our discussion of the body. We'll start with I'm asked a question. It's not presented here, but what are the two divisions of the nervous system? You learned two divisions. Rachel, if you want to type it in, you can. If you know that. I'll give you guys that are watching just a minute to think about it. The two divisions of the nervous system. Okay, you have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system consists of nerves and sensory receptors that carry information to and from the brain and spinal cord. What happens is you have sensory information that, like touch, sound, taste, smell. That information is taken in. Pressure is another sense that's taken in, and there's feedback as far as to like amounts of hormones or amounts of chemicals in your system. That information is sent to the brain and the spinal cord. That information is processed and a response is sent back. So those are the two portions, the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. Now, part of that central nervous system is the brain. This is just a picture, it's color-coded, of the different parts of the brain. We have the major portion, the cerebrum. This is where a lot of our activities and control takes place. Your cerebellum, which is behind in the occipital region of your skull, in that region. This is your brain stem. And then your very center portion of the brain is called the diencephalon. Okay, that cerebrum, like we talked about, is where your intelligence, language, personality, sensation, motor skills, motor activities, they're all controlled in this portion of the brain. In your cerebellum, that has to do with coordination of movement and balance. This occurs here. So, and understand that if these different portions of your brain are damaged, what it controls, that activity will be, the responding activity will also be inhibited. So if you've damaged this portion of your brain, it's going to affect your balance. Okay, your brain stem controls heart rate and breathing, which are known as involuntary actions. Now, I understand breathing, you can make yourself take a breath, but if you don't consciously force yourself to breathe, it will happen on its own. So heart rate, breathing, and reflexes are another involuntary response. And that's you know, if you've ever been to the doctor and they hit you, your patellar reflex, they tap your knee, and when you tap the certain nerves on your leg will kick, that's a reflex, and that's what we're referring to with reflexes. Those things that happen in response to an activity. This is your relay station. By relay station, we mean information is relayed to other parts of the brain. It also controls your emotions and memories. or they're coordinated there. I shouldn't say controls. Okay, any question on the brain? Anything? Okay, so that's, now one thing that's not presented here, nerves, the neuron is the cells that are in the nervous system. Nerves are those wires, they're chains of these neurons that transmit information to and from. And then you've got your sensory receptors, which collect the information. Those that I mentioned are parts of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, reproductive system. You know, as we've gone through biology, you've learned that organisms can reproduce asexually or sexually. Asexual is some means of the use of mitosis to produce new cells. They lack genetic variation. The organisms produced by asexual reproduction lack genetic variation. Now, sexual reproduction involves the union of cells called gametes. These gametes are a product of meiosis, which means they contain only half of the genetic information of the parent. Now, as we discussed when we talked about meiosis, it's not a random half of genetic information. It is one chromosome from each homologous pair of chromosomes in that organism. So what you get after fertilization, which is the union of those gametes, you get a completely, I shouldn't say completely, a different individual with similar characteristics of the parents. Obviously, they're going to have some characteristics from each parent, but once they're blended, you get a mix of it. So that individual is not exactly like the parent. Okay, now the female of the species produces the gamete. It's called an egg. And the male produces the sperm. Now, both of those cells, they're gametes, and they are a product of meiosis. Now, one clarification, you know, when I was grading a lot of some of the essay questions on the exam, students tend to refer to meiosis as sexual reproduction. It is not sexual reproduction. Meiosis is just the process that produces the gamete. Sexual reproduction is a result of fertilization, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. Well, after the next couple slides. Okay, this is human and animals, mammals generally and above. They have the ovary in the female of the species produce the eggs. And so you have your ovaries where the eggs are produced. They travel through the fallopian tube to the uterus. It is in the uterus where fertilization and actually initial fertilization takes place in the fallopian tube, and the fertilized egg will travel to the uterus where it implants in the uterine wall and develops. In the vagina, this is where the sperm enter, and that's also where the baby is delivered. Obviously, you know, with modern technology, when there are difficulties, babies can be delivered in humans and animals as via C-section, where you open up the uterus and take the baby out. Okay, the male reproductive system, the testes is what produces the sperm, and they travel through this epididymis. This is where the sperm is stored until they reach full maturity. And then they travel through the urethra and are expelled through the penis. And that's where, from there, that if they fertilize an egg, they will, you know, fertilize the egg in the female. Now, what happens this is a picture of a sperm penetrating the egg, the outer walls of the egg. And if it is successful, the egg and the sperm will unite to form one cell. And that cell will eventually develop into a new individual. And this is kind of presented from a human standpoint, but this is similar in mammals. Like I mentioned, mammals of the animal species. We are a mammal too, so considered an animal as far as classification goes. Now, once that first cell is formed, it divides through mitosis. Remember, mitosis produces growth in the organism. It replaces worn out cells, and it also replaces and reproduces when you need the cells. And that's what's happening here. So we have the egg and the sperm that is produced by meiosis. Through fertilization, they unite to form a new cell. This cell now has a full complement. It's called a diploid cell. It has both chromosomes from each pair, homologous pair. And that cell will, from here on, divide by mitosis. Okay, now one of the things, this cell just divides for a while, but eventually at one point in, at a certain point in this development, the cells will begin to differentiate, which means they will become different parts of the body. Now, during the first trimester, which is, there's 40 weeks in gestation for humans. Gestation is different depending on the animal you're talking about. But so you've got it's divided into 3 distinct parts. The first trimester, and generally it's 9 months, so we generally refer to it as months. So the first trimester, we can hear the heartbeat. You see evidence of a nervous system. You know, little limbs are starting to form. You can see toes and see their eye. Now it's not fully developed, but you see the eye and the ear, and that's at 12 weeks. That's pretty much the end of that first trimester. Now, the second trimester, you begin to see a lot more detail in the individual. The organs begin functioning, except for the lungs. Now the baby is in amniotic fluid, so they do not breathe. They receive, if you see the umbilical cord is what feeds the baby. It is getting blood from the mother, and that nourishment for the growth of that baby comes from that umbilical cord. You do see movement and feel movement during this trimester. Now the third trimester, the movement kind of slows down because they're larger. They're taking up most of the room in the uterus. So their eyes will open. There's less movement because of not because they can't move more, but because there's just not as much room. The lungs mature. They're still not breathing, but they mature. And at this point, the baby begins to turn head down and eventually will engage in the uterine area, ready for movement out of the vagina. Now, that's the reproductive system. Any questions? Okay. Now let's move to the circulatory system. The fluid in the circulatory system is very important. The blood is what is the mechanism of transportation. Now our heart is muscular and we have the veins that it's transported in, but that blood is where what we need is dissolved in. And it's composed of a liquid part and a solid part. So you have the plasma, which is that liquid part. It contains water, lipids, which are fats, proteins, and hormones. And it makes up more than half of our blood. And then right here you have a little, and what you're looking at, you're too young to donate blood, but when you donate blood and it sits, it will separate to where it looks like this. You have your liquid portion on top, and you have a buffy area, something that's not necessarily, and it's not as heavy, obviously, as the erythrocytes, but so it lands right there in the middle, and that's your leukocytes and platelets. Now, leukocytes are your white blood cells. These are part of the immune system. They are functional in destroying harmful foreign bodies, whether they could be parasites, it could be bacteria, but it's involved in just destroying them, in transporting them out of the body so that they don't hurt us. Platelets are also in this area. They separate. They're the part of the solid portion. They separate out. They are involved in blood clotting. There's a process when your skin is cut. I mean, and other things too. But if your skin is open and you're bleeding, your blood will begin a process of clotting. These platelets will get caught on that rough open area and eventually form a web-like network that stops that flow of blood. And eventually your body will begin its repair process through mitosis. It'll form a scab and eventually close up and repair that area. Now there are some people that have issues here. They aren't able to clot, and you know, it's a problem. So this is a bit, you know, we think of being cut as meaning the clotting, but when you're bruised, what you see, the blue part of that you see when you're bruised, is actually broken blood cells. There's bleeding below the skin. This process still is another way to repair that. People that aren't able to do that, if they bruise, you know, it can cause a major problem. Sometimes this happens when you are getting treatment for like cancer, or if you have a disease like cancer where it attacks some of these blood cells, your body doesn't behave properly. You bruise and it doesn't heal, or you bruise and it's worse than it would be if your body were functioning properly. Now the other solid part of the blood are the erythrocytes. These are very important. They are what are involved in transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, one of the questions, if you remember, I ask a lot of you in your Module 7 DBA, what is the relationship of the circulatory system and the respiratory system? This is it. The circulatory system transports the gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. The respiratory system in the lungs exchange it with the atmosphere. So we exhale carbon dioxide, inhale oxygen. Now, when you inhale, it's primarily oxygen, but it's not all oxygen. And when you exhale, it's primarily carbon dioxide, but it's not all carbon dioxide. There's a mixture in the air that we breathe. So I know that's one of those things that in your mind you think, oh, it's all oxygen that you inhale and all carbon dioxide that you exhale. But that's one of the reasons that you can do CPR. When you breathe into an individual that's not breathing, you do breathe some oxygen. So, but that's why that works. Okay, that is your blood. Now, the blood, your heart pumps the blood to the body. Now, there are some things that affect how well that blood flows through our body. Temperature. Now, as the temperature goes up, your body responds to elevated temperature by your heart beats faster, number one. It also sends blood straight to the surface of your skin, so that that's why some people more so than others, they're red-faced or their skin's really red. It's because they've got a lot of blood at the surface of the skin, because that's where if you sweat, that heat in the blood can be used to evaporate the water, and it cools your body down. So temperature does affect blood flow. It affects how it flows and where it flows. Stress also affects blood flow. It also affects your blood pressure, because our bodies, one of those, I know I mentioned earlier, reflexes. One of those reflex type actions in our body is called fight or flight. So if we're presented with a stress, our body reacts to that stress. It prepares, for instance, if you're scared, your body prepares to either flee from whatever's making you scared. Well, we aren't like animals that live out in the wild that have to physically respond, but our stresses today are a lot more subtle. we sometimes react like it's a like it's a terrifying thing, but we don't expend that energy that's produced in response. For instance, if you get angry at work, or you're mad at your teacher or something, and that stress builds up, and you've got adrenaline flowing and all of this preparation to fight back, and you don't expend it, that has a negative effect on your blood pressure and different activities in your body. Genetics impact blood flow. Some people are more prone to blood pressure issues and things like that. The fact that we talked earlier about some people who don't produce platelets, or different things that can affect your blood flow. Diseases that you get will affect your blood flow, diabetes in particular. And while another one that people sometimes will call disease is obesity. Obesity impacts blood flow greatly, in that the more mass you have, the harder your heart has to work to get the blood to nourish all of those cells. Obesity is generally attached to a sedentary lifestyle, so not moving around will also affect your ability of your heart to work. Now, blood clots, which may be related to disease and genetics, but clots will stop the flow, so that does affect overall blood flow in the body. Okay, we mentioned the leukocytes. Excuse me. The leukocytes respond to, and I mentioned that they respond to foreign harmful things that can enter our body. Now, and those harmful things are generally referred to as a pathogen. A pathogen is something that enters your body that can cause disease. Now, your body will respond to it in two different ways. It will specifically target that pathogen. It recognizes it by the tag, a protein tag in the cell as not being there, and it will form a antibody, or actually the leukocytes will actually destroy that cell and get rid of it. Now, some things that will help with this process are vaccinations. In a vaccination, you are introduced to either a weakened form of the disease or a dead form of the disease. So what your body does is recognizes it, and it forms these responses, either the antigen or antibody that will destroy it, or the memory to destroy it, and files it away. So if your body encounters the actual disease, it already has what's necessary to destroy it on file. So it kind of reduces that lag time, because there's a time, and when you encounter a disease, that sickness that you have, that's because that pathogen has been able to do its damage without being defeated, and eventually your body produces what is necessary to destroy it, and you'll get rid of it and you get well. Now, another substance that helps with that is the antibiotics. Antibiotics support this immune system. Now, nonspecific are just inflammation. A fever is another nonspecific response. Your body increases, for instance, if you injure yourself, it's cut, your body increases the fluid in that area, because it's that fluid that's going to take away those damaged, those pathogens that the leukocytes have damaged or killed. So it's going to move it away. So that inflammation is a nonspecific. It's not specifically targeting a cell, but it is part of that healing and fighting illness process. Okay, any questions? I know I'm kind of talking fast here. All right, now let's talk about bacteria and viruses. Now we've talked, one of the questions on your exam that you took was about antibiotics. treating bacteria and viruses. Antibiotics are not used to treat viruses because they are considered non-living. So they can't be killed. Viruses only exhibit characteristics of life when they're in a host cell. So if you kill the virus, you'll kill the cell, the host cell. So they're not, and generally that's why when you go and the doctor says, oh, you have a virus, it has just run its course. Excuse me. But the bacteria, on the other hand, are living. So they can, antibiotics can be used to kill them. And what antibiotics do is they disrupt those living processes of bacteria. They either destroy the cell wall, they destroy their genetic material, but they just kind of disrupt the things that make them alive. But that's one of those questions that may show up on the exam. Okay, now some ways that you can personally keep from getting sick, and we had a lab that kind of looked at this. Washing hands is hands we touch everything, and people's hands and desktops where other people's hands have been. So just washing your hands is an incredible resistance to disease. Vaccinations, we discussed those. If you cough, cover your mouth. This was another thing that we discussed during our lessons. Taking all of your antibiotics is very important. Don't stop when you start feeling better because you still have bacteria that haven't been completely killed. And what bacteria do is they go into a dormant state. They form an endospore where they can protect themselves from the vaccination. So if you quit taking protect themselves from the antibiotic, or your body's fighting them off. So if you don't finish your antibiotics and that bacteria survives, it'll come out of its dormant state, and what it's going to do, it's got some information about that antibiotic now, and it's going to incorporate it into its genetic makeup, and it will then pass that on to future generations. So you have produced a resistant strain to the medication. Okay, so these are very important things. And now I have, like I said, we just skimmed over our body systems. So if you have any questions or something that you want to discuss with me, feel free to make contact with me. But otherwise, I look forward to seeing you next week at our EOC and hopefully on Thursday as well.